welcome everybody. Welcome to Earth Week. I'm Teddy Lutelier. I'm the Sustainability Manager for UM. And before we start the presentation, I'd like to give you some housekeeping rules. Very simple. The chat is disabled, so you can ask a question, but you have to do it through the Q&A button. And we'll try to answer one or two questions at the end of the presentation by Mike. And today we have the honor to have a very special guest with us. He's going to be talking about this intimate relationship between our food system and climate change. And to introduce our speaker, I want to welcome our beloved director of the Abbess Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy, Kenneth Broad. Kenneth.
All right. Happy Earth Day. What an Earth it's been. Sort of a crazy last 5 billion years. I guess 2021 is no exception. Anyhow, as extreme events do, be they in the realm of social justice or human health or large-scale environmental phenomenon, we're sort of repeatedly and unfortunately often harshly reminded of this interconnectivity that links humans and our environment. And today's speaker, he's dedicated a good part of his career to revealing these connections and how history, industry, and politics has shaped the landscape that we currently rely on. Mike Grunwald is a journalist, essayist, a best-selling author. He's got expertise in public policy, particularly in energy, climate, agriculture, as you'll hear, food, transportation, finance, urban issues. I could keep going for another 20 minutes. He's the winner of the George Polk Award for National Reporting, the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Reporting, and many other honors. Mike's been a friend of the Abbess Center for many, many years, and he's currently an Abbess Scholar. I was first introduced to Mike by Mary Doyle, the founding director of the Abbess Center. Also, she was the former dean of the UM Law School, who was an instrumental player in drafting the Everglades Restoration Act, and she worked under Bruce Batty. I met Mary, who was a force of nature herself, when I first came to UM in 2001, and she was working with Donna Shalala to design a cutting-edge interdisciplinary center, bringing together scholars and practitioners that eventually, with the generous underwriting of the Abbess family, became the Leonard and Jane Abbess Center for Ecosystem Science and Policy. When I first walked into Mary's office, one of the first things she did was hand me Mike's book, The Swamp, Everglades, Florida, and the Politics of Paradise. It's a must-read for anyone who's spent any time here in South Florida or is considering it, and it really will give you some insight into understanding the, I guess, technical terms, the wackiness that underlies the situation that we find ourselves in down here in South Florida. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mike's prolific writings. He's currently a senior writer at Politico magazine. He previously had a long stint as the senior national correspondent at Time magazine. And prior to that, he was with the Washington Post and the Boston Globe. In addition to The Swamp and countless articles and essays, his 2012 book, The New Deal, The Hidden Story of Climate Change in the Obama Era, was on the New York Times bestseller list for, I think, well over a month. So today you'll get a preview of his new book that's coming out with Simon & Schuster. It deals with food and climate change. Personally, I would say food is one of my favorite ways to stay alive. But the joy I get out of every bite is sort of increasingly, I don't know, tainted or diminished the more I understand the linkages between our industrialized food production system to certainly to the multiple impacts that include land use, climate change, the incredibly widespread antibiotic use that's dramatically increasing our vulnerability to further pandemics and really threatens to undermine many of the advances we've made in medicine. And certainly the dimensions of animal slaughter. So on that very happy note, but with the caveat that Mike will discuss many of the very viable solutions for dealing with the combination of increasing demand for food, but some of the new technologies, behavioral aspects, policy solutions that are out there, and what really can give us hope for averting what's a crisis, truly a crisis of survival. So I'd like to welcome Mike Grunwald to our virtual Earth Day stage. All right, Mike, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Kenny, with that very weird virtual background. Let me share my screen here. And I also want to thank the Abbas Center, which is really terrific. It does such a great job with ecosystem science and policy. So happy Earth Day. I'm honored to deliver what's hopefully one of the U's last Zoom lectures before we start boring each other in person again. And I'm grateful for your interest in climate issues. They're not as sexy as the Royals or the Oscars or whatever we're clicking on today, but they do threaten the future of our species on Earth. That's a bummer, because the Earth is a very hospitable planet for our species. It's the only one we know of with pizza, breathable air, and decent Wi-Fi. The big message of the original Earth Day half a century ago was that we should try harder not to ruin it, which is still a good message to keep in mind while I blather about climate change today.
Mike, can I interrupt just a second? I want to make sure, you said that you were sharing the presentation. We don't see it, so just...
Sorry, there we go.
Perfect, thanks.
Let's see. And is it... Okay, it does.
It's perfect. Yeah.
But it's not moving.
You use the arrows. Yep, perfect.
I was trying the arrows. Okay. All right, here we go. All right. So I'm going to start with a quick overview of the climate crisis, which is awful and scary, though in some ways getting less awful and scary. But I'm mostly going to talk about the neglected half of the climate crisis, the half that isn't about fossil fuels. It's about the food we eat, the farms that make the food, and the forests that get destroyed to make room for those farms. People are starting to realize this half of the crisis is extremely awful and extremely scary. Like Kenny said, this isn't always a cheery topic. But another big message of the original Earth Day was that change is possible. Tomorrow doesn't have to look like today. A bunch of hippies got together the year I was born and said, hey, let's not make such a mess of a planet. And soon we had a Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, an Endangered Species Act, an entire environmental movement. So fair warning, I'm going to talk about how screwed we are, but then I'll talk about getting unscrewed. Kenny mentioned I've been an amateur historian, and now I guess I'm playing amateur academic, but I'm really a reporter. So I'm going to tell some stories from my reporting on some of the better and worse solutions. All right, so if you're taking the time to watch a dorky writer talk about climate change, you probably already know it's real, it's here, it's us, and it's a big freaking problem. Atmospheric carbon levels have soared to a 3 million year high. You can see right over here, there's a nice predictable cycle, and then the 20th century comes and woof, not good. The Earth has already warmed, you can see, by 1 degree Celsius, and that blip in temperature is already weirding the weather. It's accelerating horrific wildfires, unprecedented ice melts, lethally intense storms and droughts. As Al Gore once said to me, the nightly news is like a nature hike through the book of Revelations. You can see here's California burning, there's Houston drowning. 19 of the last 20 years were among the 20 hottest ever recorded. Coral reefs are dying. We're running a real-time experiment of what happens when the Earth's atmosphere gets inundated with the same heat-trapping gases that made Venus uninhabitable. And it's not going great. I'm sorry to be Debbie Downer, but global warming is really bad. And for a while, at least, it's going to keep getting worse. Our global economy still relies on 1 billion fossil fueled vehicles and 4 billion megawatts of fossil fueled electricity. We've emitted more greenhouse gases since the 1997 Kyoto Protocol than we emitted in all human history before Kyoto. Oh, sorry. And emissions are cumulative. The carbon you emit today, charging your phone or watching this Zoom, could trap heat for 1,000 years. Most scientists think we're already probably doomed to 1.5 degrees of warming, the official goal of the Paris Accords, and possibly 2 degrees, the unofficial shorthand for climate hell. Here you can see that we're currently on track for an extremely hellish 3.5 degrees. It's a buzzkill, I know. It can feel like we're watching our own slow motion train wreck. You can see here what my hometown of Miami is supposed to look like in a few decades. Fossil fuels are still so ubiquitous that eliminating them from modern life can sound like a totally absurd fantasy, like building a city out of taffy. You start to understand the attraction of climate denialism that rejects the inconvenient science, or climate fatalism that insists we're so screwed that nothing we do matters. Even those of us who acknowledge the climate crisis, we don't live with a crisis mentality, as if we truly believed our planetary home was on fire. It doesn't actually feel like we're living on Venus, where surface temperatures get hot enough to melt lead. I mean, I've got solar panels and an all-electric Chevy Bolt. I'm writing a book about climate change, and even I tune out the doom and gloom forecasts about my own city's future as Atlantis. They're just too depressing. So let's do some good news. The absurd fantasy of fossil fuel energy is getting a little bit less absurd every day. A new green revolution really has begun. The most drastic change has been the greening of electricity, especially the collapse of coal. A decade ago, coal generated half of America's power. Today, it's less than 1/5. You can see in the UK here on the left, coal use is at the lowest level since the invention of the steam engine. Meanwhile, the costs of wind turbines and solar panels have fallen so dramatically that it's usually cheaper to build a brand new wind or solar plant than to burn coal in an existing plant. You can see here the solar boom of the last decade, right out of nowhere. America has already cut our electricity emissions 40%, even though we just had a climate denier president and a coal lobbyist EPA head. Of course, we now have a president who takes the crisis seriously. I hung out with Joe Biden a lot for my last book, and he loved talking about clean energy. Now he's committed to a zero emissions power grid by 2035. And this morning he announced a target of cutting US emissions in half by 2030. It's just crazy how quickly the unfathomable has become plausible. Look, the world isn't going fossil free anytime soon. More than half the planet's electricity is still fossil fueled, and we're not making nearly as much progress in other sectors. That dude up there with the chicken legs, he loves his Bolt, and major automakers keep committing to phase out internal combustion engines, but the overwhelming majority of the world's vehicles still burn gas. The global transition to clean energy is going to take years, and millions of lives will depend on how many years it ends up taking. The thing is, the transition has begun. And now that clean has gotten cheap, there's no turning back. We can now see how the fossil fuel story ends, even though we don't know when it ends. So that's some good news. Yay. The bad news is that the fossil fuel story is only the familiar part of the climate story. Even if we miraculously solve the fossil fuel problem, we're still heading to climate hell unless we fix the other half of the problem: our foods, farms, forests, our land. To avoid the nastiest climate outcomes, we not only need to quit fossil fuels that emit carbon, we need to preserve forests and other ecosystems that store carbon. And they're endangered by the spread of farms and pastures that you can see here already cover half the Earth's land, almost. We need more natural landscapes to stop and eventually reduce our warming. But natural landscapes like the Amazon rainforest here are constantly getting converted into agricultural landscapes. Producing enough calories to feed our fast-growing population without chewing up the carbon sinks that can stabilize our fast-warming climate will be as huge a challenge as ending oil. How huge? Well, the World Resources Institute calculated that if current trends hold, the world will need to increase its agricultural footprint 70% to feed nearly 10 billion people by 2050. That would require clearing, you can see here, another 1.5 billion acres of forests and other natural landscapes. That's a landmass nearly twice the size of India. That would mean the end of the Amazon and other carbon sinks that are biodiverse and magical, and also our best defenses against climate chaos. So those current trends better not hold. We cannot keep converting the Earth into a farm. In fact, scientists believe that to meet the Paris targets, the world needs to end all deforestation by 2050, while also launching a massive campaign of reforestation to soak up more of the carbon our fossil fueled economy has released. Now, it would be great if some genius could invent a shortcut, but so far, the only reliable technology we've discovered to remove carbon from the atmosphere is the 3.5 billion year old process of photosynthesis, which transforms sunlight into vegetation that offsets our emissions as it grows. I mean, thanks to the daily miracle of photosynthesis, forests already help soak up about a fifth of the carbon we emit today. So that's why deforestation is such a carbon bomb. It creates a double whammy of more emissions now and also fewer emissions avoided in the future. But you know, starvation sucks too. And nearly 1 billion people are already undernourished. So there's intense pressure to keep clearing more trees so we can grow more food. The world is losing a soccer field worth of carbon absorbing rainforest every 6 seconds. So if we're going to stop releasing carbon by destroying forests and start undoing emissions by expanding forests, we'll have to overcome a gigantic food gap. You can see here, we'll need to produce an additional 7,400 trillion calories every year to feed humanity. That's an annual increase of more than 50%, or about 800 extra Olive Garden breadsticks for every human being on the planet every year. And we'll have to do that while somehow shrinking our overall agricultural footprint. In other words, we need to stop eating the earth, or at least quite so much of the earth. The climate problem beyond fossil fuels is a land problem. This is my Earth Day message. We need to make more food with less land so we don't consume the wild places that can help prevent climate hell. We need to start treating our limited land as our most precious resource, because it needs to produce much more nutrition to sustain us and also sequester much more carbon to save us. We'll need to make wiser choices about how we use our land, and we'll need to leave a lot more of it alone. Now, those of us who love cheeseburgers hate to hear this, but a massive part of the land problem is a meat and dairy problem. Animal agriculture already has a bad reputation for cruelty, pollution, antibiotic resistance, even pandemic risks. And it has a bad climate reputation because cattle farts and burps, you've probably heard, they emit methane, a greenhouse gas 30 times more potent than carbon, while cattle manure emits nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas 200 times more potent than carbon. But still, the most urgent problem with animal agriculture is that it's wiping out wilderness. 80% of the world's agricultural land is devoted to livestock that supplies just 20% of the world's calories. It is mind-boggling how land-intensive it is to raise livestock. An area 3 times the size of Europe is now an animal farm. Chicken and pork require at least 3 times as much land per gram of protein as beans or peas. And you can see beef and lamb can require 50 times as much land per calorie. Milk and cheese are somewhere in between. If all the world's cattle formed their own nation, it would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. Our cheeseburgers really are grilling the planet. Oh, and here's a little more cheery news. Let me get this right. While the fossil fuel problem is getting better, just way too slowly, the land problem is getting worse. The number of mouths to feed on Earth is increasing, while the amount of land on Earth is not, and those mouths are eating more meat every day. By 2050, global demand for ruminants like cattle is projected to almost double. That means nearly twice as many farts and burps, nearly twice as much manure, and nearly twice as much land needed to grow the grass and grain that ruminants eat before we eat them. And those projections assume 6 billion people will still be too poor to have significant amounts of meat in their diets. That is not good. And you know what else is making the land problem worse? Climate change. It's not going to be easy to make more food with less land when making food keeps getting harder, as nastier storms and floods wipe out harvests, and nastier heat waves scorch crops, stress livestock, and parch water supplies. Crop pests and diseases are also depressing farm yields as they invade regions that used to be too cold, while warmer oceans are depressing seafood yields. The ravenous bark beetles and hideous wildfires that are ravaging California's forests are unleashing more emissions than the state's 1 million solar rooftops are preventing. I hope you're getting the drift. The land problem is a ginormous problem. Probably not quite as ginormous as the fossil fuel problem yet, but the more progress we make with fossil fuels, the bigger a portion of the climate problem it will be. We need to think as urgently about the carbon in our trees, grasses, and soils as we think about the primordial carbon in our coal, gas, and oil. And we'll have to make changes as unimaginable as ditching fossil fuels. Here's another way to think about it. To hit those Paris targets for 2050, we'll have to reduce global emissions from farms, forests, and the land sector. You can see here by 11 gigatons a year. That's more emissions than the entire global industrial sector, transportation sector, or electricity sector. That means a successful approach to the land problem would need to slash greenhouse gases more than shutting down every factory on Earth, scrapping every car, truck, ship, and plane on Earth, or retiring every coal-fired, gas-fired, and oil-fired power plant on Earth. So yeah, that's a problem. Feeding the world without frying the world is another absurd fantasy that needs to become reality in a hurry. And unfortunately, land is a much more complex problem than fossil fuels. As brutally hard as it will be to kick our fossil habit, we at least know how to do it. You generate clean electricity like we're already starting to do, and then you electrify just about everything. A lot of the technology we need to do it is already cost competitive. It's just a question of political will. But the land problem isn't a tidy just do it situation like that, because there's no consensus about what to do. All right, so that's the problem. Let's talk a bit about what to do. Again, I don't have all the answers. Some of these are pretty new questions, but I do know that there isn't one simple solution to this wicked problem. Some advocates say it would vanish if the world just stopped eating meat or wasting food or bulldozing nature. Well, the world doesn't work like that. Other activists insist the problem is simply industrial agriculture, right? With its assembly line corporate feedlots that treat animals like widgets and its soulless monoculture croplands that rely on perennial chemical warfare. Well, there's a lot not to like about big ag's exploitation of migrant workers, its high fructose crap that makes us sick and obese, its ridiculous government subsidies. But I'm sorry to report that eliminating factory farming would actually accelerate the climate crisis. You know, it's just as easy to romanticize artisanal red barn family farms where soil is nurtured with love, animals have names instead of numbers, and trust is placed in Mother Nature rather than Dow pesticides. But sorry, they're often part of the problem. The inconvenient truth is that it's complicated. Organic, local, and grass-fed isn't necessarily better for the climate than conventional, imported, and corn-fed. Rules protecting forest in one place won't cut emission if they just lead to deforestation in another place. The science, the economics, the policy, the politics, it's all complicated. And that's the most important difference between the carbohydrate mess and the hydrocarbon mess. Fossil fuels are now a straightforward moral challenge. We need to leave them underground instead of extracting and combusting them. The land problem is not straightforward. We've still got to figure it out. So what have we figured? Well, the first rule about what to do when you're in a hole is to stop digging. So a first step would be to abandon some government policies that are digging the hole deeper. You can see I'm talking about mandates and subsidies promoting the use of land for bioenergy. That's biofuels for transportation, like corn ethanol, soy biodiesel, and palm oil, as well as biomass power, which is basically burning trees for electricity. They're not solving the fossil fuel problem, and they're making the land problem much harder to solve. You can see here, my first big climate story in 2008 was about how corn ethanol isn't really green. Its emissions are about twice as bad as gasoline's. And here's my most recent big climate story. It's about how biomass power isn't really green. For it to produce just 2% of the world's energies, we would have to double the world's wood harvest and really ransack global forests. Basically, land turns out to be terrific at growing food, terrific at storing carbon, extremely inefficient at growing energy. Now, a Princeton scholar named Tim Searchinger, he first showed in a 2008 paper that biofuels are a climate disaster. And the reason is that they induce land use change. When you use good farmland to grow fuel instead of food, somebody somewhere else is going to convert carbon-rich natural land into farmland to replace that food. The US now uses 40 million acres of its best farmland to grow corn ethanol, and that is dramatically expanding the world's agricultural footprint. This is the crux of the land problem. There's a finite amount of land on Earth, and somehow it's going to have to produce enough food and store enough carbon to keep our species afloat. We cannot waste it. You know, it's funny, it also has to provide space for us to live. Which you would think is another huge problem, but it's actually much smaller. Only 1% of the Earth's land is developed. We really are an animal farm. But Tim's insight was that we need to use every acre as productively as possible because there are trade-offs. And it's interesting, Tim is now at the World Resources Institute. And a decade after he first identified the land problem, he created the first real blueprint for solving it. A 22-course menu of possible solutions with a bunch of charts that you may have noticed I've been stealing from my slides. Anyway, biomass power is very similar. It's supposed to be green because you burn trees for electricity, which emits carbon, but then you can replant trees, which reabsorbs carbon, just like a cornfield. The European Union's Renewable Energy Directive actually considers biomass automatically carbon neutral. And that's why millions of tons of wood are being harvested in US forests, processed into pellets, shipped across the Atlantic, and burned in European power plants. But chopping down trees and burning them instead of letting them grow creates a huge carbon bomb now, and studies show it takes decades or even centuries for the replanted trees to reabsorb all that carbon. We do not have decades or centuries to start reducing our emissions. It's just a dumb use of land. Solar panels would generate 100 times as much power per acre as biomass. But the European rules have created a real biomass boom. And if Biden passes a similar clean power mandate that considers biomass to be clean power, more trees are going to be burned in the name of green energy. So, all right, that's action item number 1, stop pushing bioenergy. But what should we push? Well, just as destroying carbon sinks is often awful for the climate, creating carbon sinks is great for the climate. There's a big global push to plant 1 trillion trees, which could help, depending where they plant them. Burning trees is bad. Planting trees is usually good, assuming you don't plant them on prime farmland and assuming you don't cut them down too quickly. Another nice way to store carbon is silvopasture, which is a fancy word for planting a lot of trees that provide shade as well as carbon storage on grazing land. But my favorite carbon sink solution is restoring drained peatlands and other wetlands. Kenny mentioned that I wrote a book about the Everglades. Well, the swamp had a whole section about one of Florida's classic swampland scams, a development called Golden Gate Estate that was supposed to be the world's largest subdivision. It's a funny story. The developers got rich selling baldness tonics that made with sheep oil. Their slogan was, "Have you ever seen a bald sheep?" And then they got even richer flying suckers into the swamp and literally threatened to abandon them there if they didn't sign a contract. It was the ultimate land by the gallon swindle. Most of the area remained a barren expanse of roads and canals until the $16 billion government plan to resuscitate the Everglades included a project to restore half of Golden Gate Estates into 50,000 acres of wetlands. I visited, and you can see the wetlands are returning where they plugged the canals. Wading birds are coming back, and the carbon is too. Restoring wetlands has amazing potential to help the climate. Rehydrating the 0.5% of farmland on drained peatlands could reduce global emissions by 2%. That's not 2% of farm emissions, that's 2% of all emissions. So it would be like eliminating all emissions from Germany or all emissions from aviation. Restoration is a really big target of opportunity. The hottest carbon sink approach these days in policy circles, Biden's team talks about it all the time, is to store more carbon in agricultural soil. It's easy to see why this is such an alluring idea, because the world has so damn much agricultural soil. The big global campaign on this issue is called 4 per thousand, because increasing soil carbon on all the world's farms by just 0.4% would offset all the world's carbon emissions. The trendy solution to achieving that goal is known as regenerative agriculture. It's really farming in harmony with nature. If you want to learn about it, you can see there are approximately 1 billion books about how regenerative ag is going to revive the soil and rejuvenate the microbiome and cure just about everything that ails our culture, including sciatica and roaming charges. You can see there are documentaries too. In Kiss the Ground, you can hear Woody Harrelson explain how carbon farming is going to save the world. The only problem is that there isn't much evidence that regenerative agriculture actually restores carbon in the soil. That's really concerning because big food conglomerates like General Mills are trying to meet their climate goals by pushing their farmers to adopt regenerative practices. Entire carbon markets are emerging that reward farmers who adopt regenerative practices. And then Biden wants to pay farmers to adopt regenerative practices. Look, planting cover crops does seem to help a bit, and reducing excess fertilizer use can help a lot. But fertilizer also helps crops grow. So yields could crash if what's being reduced isn't actually wasteful. And that means more farmland would be needed to produce the same amount of food, which means more destruction of carbon sinks. And the science behind other regenerative practices like no-till and diverse cropping, it's really pretty thin. I did visit a regenerative grazing operation owned by the California eco-billionaire Tom Steyer. You can see his wife there. She runs a very intensely managed ranch with incredibly thorough scientific monitoring. The idea is to get the cattle to mimic the migration patterns of the wild buffalo that used to wander across the plains. And in the process, it's supposed to restore degraded soil. It's really impressive. It's reducing erosion, it's restoring biodiversity, but so far it hasn't increased soil carbon at all. In fact, Steyer's sampling numbers have gotten worse. And the Steyer ranch has a very small herd, so it's producing less beef per acre than the traditional ranch, which again means somebody somewhere else has to bulldoze more nature to run more cattle to produce the same amount of beef. And that's a climate killer. It's worth studying all of these practices because maybe they can increase soil carbon and maybe there are ways to do them without sacrificing yields. But there's a ton of political momentum behind regenerative ag and not nearly as much momentum behind any other fixes. A lot of eggs are being placed in a very speculative baskets. The politicians love sending money to farmers, and there's a lot of interest in sending farmers cash to do regenerative stuff without a lot of evidence it'll help the climate. And we know the world will need more food. So shifting towards farming practices that produce less food, not necessarily a step in the right direction. Okay, planting trees is great, restoring nature is great, storing more carbon on farms is at least worth studying, but we have got to stop expanding the world's agricultural footprint. And that means we need to make more food on less land, which means we need to increase farm yields. The good news right here, the world has gotten much better at increasing yields. You probably have heard of the original post-war green revolution that tripled global cereal yields and saved billions from malnutrition. It started with improved crop breeding techniques. It went on to include chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, synthetic fertilizers made from natural gas, but also better irrigation, giant tractors and other modernized equipment, and genetically modified seeds that also turbocharged yields. At the same time, animal agriculture has also enjoyed big yield increases, thanks to better breeding, better veterinary care, and other advances. America now produces the same amount of beef it did in 1970 with 1/3 fewer cattle. The average California dairy cow produces 4 times as much milk as a cow in Mexico and 23 times as much as a cow in India. Big Ag happens to be very good and very efficient at manufacturing food. And as you can see here on the right, manufacturing more food per acre has spared an awful lot of natural acres, all of these. There are huge opportunities to produce even more food with even less land if we could export our efficiency advances to poorer countries so that India's dairy cows could produce like ours. The bad news is, remember those scary land projections I mentioned earlier? The ones warning that if current trends hold, we'll have to deforest 2 Indias worth of land to feed the world? Well, the excellent yield increases of the last 50 years were part of those current trends. So that means we need to do way better than that to avoid disaster. And the even worse news is that yield increases have tapered off a bit. So this short 2 India bar, that's actually an optimistic baseline. If yield increases only follow the path of the last 20 years, we're actually on track to deforest 3 Indias worth of land. And if droughts and floods and pests stop us from achieving any yield increases, we'll have to deforest 10 Indias worth of land. I hate to tell you, we don't have 10 Indias worth of land. So how can we jack up yields? One solution is to export the green revolution to parts of the world where poor smallholder farmers don't have access to synthetic fertilizers or pesticides or GMO seeds or tractors or even decent weather reports. A lot of people hate this. They think the Gates Foundation is forcing industrial agriculture down the throats of the third world. They don't want to export big ag with all its chemicals and antibiotics and oppression. But from a climate perspective, we do need to export more of big ag's efficiency. I get it. Fertilizer is a menace. Nitrogen created that giant dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. You may have seen a leaking phosphate mine just became Florida's latest eco-disaster. But lack of fertilizer is also a menace. If smallholders can get fertilizer and drought-tolerant crops and irrigation, they can increase yields, make more money, maybe get cook stoves instead of burning carbon-rich trees as firewood, and start a nice virtuous cycle. The latest wave of the green revolution is known as precision agriculture. It's cool. It's about improving efficiency with digital technology and GPS and big data rather than toxic chemistry. It's about wired tractors that automatically fertilize the areas that need it and don't fertilize the areas that don't. I visited a skyscraper in Tel Aviv to see a startup here called Prospera. They call themselves the data wizards in muddy boots. They've got sensors attached to pivot irrigation systems throughout the Midwest. And those sensors combine the Internet of Things with artificial intelligence. They not only tell the irrigation systems when to water the crops, but they tell the farmers when they need to fertilize or spray pesticides to maximize production. While I was visiting, one of the engineers got a text with a satellite photo of a tiny pest on a soybean plant in Nebraska. He then zoomed in on the field and sent a text himself warning the farmer that he might have the beginnings of an outbreak. Entrepreneurs are also experimenting with brand new forms of food production. An hour south of me in Homestead, a Norwegian aquaculture firm called Atlantic Sapphire is building a high-tech inland fish farm that's eventually supposed to produce 200,000 tons of salmon a year, nearly half current US salmon production on consumption on just 160 acres of land. It is an unbelievably efficient operation. Cows eat 6 pounds of feed for every 1 pound of beef. Cows eat 6 pounds of feed for every 1 pound of beef. These salmon convert 1 pound of feed into 1 pound of fillet. And it's all done in indoor tanks that replicate the salmon life cycle. So there's no impact on oceans, no exposure to seaborne diseases or microplastics, no antibiotics, and no flying in fish from Chile or Norway like we do for the rest of our salmon. It's astonishing. These guys who look like Vikings and talk like tech bros, they're building a cold water fish factory the size of the Mall of America at the edge of the Everglades. Now, granted, they've had 2 major accidents since I visited that have killed 1 million fish. So they're still working out the kinks. But you can buy their Blue House salmon at Publix. It's organic and it's good. Another potential game changer is a hardy tree called Pangamia. It grows wild in India and Australia. There's even some down here in Crandon Park. Its seed pods are a lot like soybeans, except they're so bitter nobody will eat them, not even cattle. So a guy named Naveen Sika decided to try to debitter them because Pangamias are amazing. They're flood tolerant, drought tolerant, salt tolerant. They don't need good farmland to grow. They store lots of carbon, they're perennial, they're even leguminous, which means they fix nitrogen from the air so they don't need fertilizer. Sika started a company called Tarviva, and they had a real miracle. They stumbled across a completely harmless solvent that debitters Pangamia. But then the next problem was finding someone to plant Pangamia, because farmers do not like taking risks on new crops, especially trees that don't have a harvest for 4 years. But again, another miracle, not a very happy miracle, but a disease practically wiped out the Florida citrus industry. So some desperate citrus farmers were willing to plant Pangamia in their wiped out orange groves. They planted 1,000 acres in Florida. You can see Naveen here with my son in a Pangamia field, and it really is a miracle crop. It's quadrupling soybean yields per acre with no irrigation, fertilizer, or chemicals. And it's just getting started. With better breeding, Pangamia might produce 10 times US soybean yields. It's vertical soy. Unfortunately, we're only talking about 1,000 acres. The world has more than 4 billion acres of cropland. But if Pangamia can scale up and every acre can replace 10 acres of soybeans while storing way more carbon, that's a crop that can help save forests and save the climate. There are a lot of scientists using brave new world technology to try to boost yields. At the University of California at Davis, I witnessed the first ever successful implantation of a genetically edited embryo into a cow. That here is not a one-armed man. It's a pretty intrusive procedure. The embryo was manipulated with the genetic scissors known as CRISPR to create a boys-only chromosome to ensure the calf would be male, which is really useful because males are more efficient at producing beef, mostly because they don't have to grow ovaries in a reproductive system. A couple months after this beautiful procedure, I got an email from the scientist in charge with a sonogram. It's a boy. I was like, yeah, it better be. And there you can see Cosmo, the CRISPR cow with his mom. Maybe it's creepy, but you can imagine all kinds of gene edits to make crops and livestock more efficient. Here's one more of the future at the University of Illinois, where a team of scientists with a Gates Foundation grant is using supercomputers and genomics to re-engineer photosynthesis. I know, photosynthesis had a pretty good run, sustaining life on Earth and all. But like Searchinger says, it was invented by blue-green algae 3 billion years ago, and they weren't that bright. For example, photosynthesis shuts down for a while when clouds pass overhead. The Illinois team created a bypass that reboots the process much quicker. Plants also sometimes grab an oxygen atom by mistake instead of a carbon atom, which wastes time and energy. These guys engineered a workaround. They're still decades away from getting re-engineered crops to market, but they've already field tested 4 upgrades to photosynthesis that could increase yields by more than 50%. All right, we've been talking about food supply. But what about the demand side? Couldn't we all fix the land problem by going vegan? Yeah. And also, good luck. It's true that if we simply stopped using grasslands and farmlands for livestock, we could feed the world without expanding our farm print. But humans have been eating meat for 2 million years. Evolutionary biologists believe it's a big part of what made us human. Our ancestors who started eating meat needed bigger brains to track down prey and smaller stomachs because they didn't need to digest as much roughage. And that's the branch of our family tree that ended up at Homo sapiens. I'm all for dreaming impossible dreams, but as the president says, come on, man. WRI's blueprint of how to feed the world without frying the world sets a target of reducing global per capita consumption of ruminants by 30%, which means the average American would have to eat 50% less beef. That would be a radical shift in our diets. And that's just one of WRI's 22 solutions. So even if we achieved it, we'd still have to do all kinds of other radical stuff to increase supply and reduce demand. Incidentally, one slightly off-topic way to reduce demand would be to try to rein in population growth. Don't take that the wrong way. Obviously, we don't want famines or pandemics or wars to ease the pressure on the forests. It's gross. But it is true that the places with the highest rates of population growth, especially sub-Saharan Africa, are the places with the highest rates of poverty, infant mortality, and other suffering. We've seen in countries like Bangladesh that good policies can drive massive voluntary reductions in fertility. These policies don't involve food or farms, so I'm not an expert, but a quick spoiler alert: when girls have access to education and women have decent healthcare and contraceptive services, their economic outcomes soar and birth rates plunge. If the advances in educating girls and expanding family planning in Bangladesh happened in Africa, the challenge of feeding the world without frying the world would be a lot less huge. Another easy way to solve the global food demand problem that isn't actually easy: eliminate food waste. Humanity wastes about 1/3 of the food it grows. That means we waste 1/3 of the land we use to grow it, 1/3 of the fertilizer and chemicals and water. If we just stopped wasting food, we'd instantly eliminate 1/3 of all agricultural emissions. Again, good luck. In poor countries, food waste is not about failing to join the Clean Plate Club. It's food loss, where farmers can't get their harvest to market before it spoils because they don't have refrigerated trucks or decent storage or modern logistics. That's hard to fix. In the rich world, yeah, most of our food gets wasted at home or in restaurants or at the store because we won't buy soft avocados or ugly fruit. Changing that would require changing behaviors, which is also hard. WRI sets a goal of reducing food waste 25%, and even they acknowledge it's highly ambitious. Still, it's worth a shot. Technology can help. Here you can see a biotech company called Appeal Sciences is using all natural materials to create an extra protective peel around fruit and vegetables so they take much longer to spoil. You can see natural versus Appeal there on the side. Kroger is already carrying Appeal avocados, and they throw a lot fewer of them away. There is so much happening in the food waste space, from apps connecting juice bars to farmers with extra produce, startups upcycling throwaway food from farms or processing plants into pet food or nutritious dried snacks, cafeterias that sell food by the pound or just offer smaller plates. And government policies can help too, by reforming over-stringent sell-by dates or making it easier and safer for groceries and restaurants to donate to food banks. All right, we've arrived at the hottest solution of the 2020s: alternative protein, the euphemism for fake meat and dairy. Pat Brown, the genius chemist who founded Impossible Foods, he wants to replace all animal agriculture with plant-based meat by 2035. Again, good luck. It's true that plant-based meat is booming. It's in every fast food joint and major supermarket. Tyson and JBS and all the other giant meat companies are scrambling to make their own plant-based options. But it's still less than 1% of the meat market. The California company Just makes a nice liquid egg product from mung beans. Its sales have now displaced 100 million eggs. It's a $1 billion company. But the world eats more than 1 trillion eggs a year. So again, a long ways to go. Still, alternative protein is incredibly exciting. These aren't the old hockey puck veggie burgers for eco-conscious vegans. This is plant-based food for carnivores sold in the meat aisle. I get asked a lot, isn't it processed food? Well, yeah, trust me, bovine digestion is also a process. Is it healthy? Well, an Impossible Burger is not as healthy as kale, but it's got no cholesterol, less saturated fat than a beef burger. It does have more sodium, but one nice thing about high-tech foods is that they can improve, while cows are a pretty mature technology. I remember telling Ethan Brown, the CEO of Beyond Meats, he's right there, that his burgers taste good, but they smell gross on the grill. He was like, I know, our scientists are working on it. I also told him that beef doesn't agree with me, and his burgers don't agree with me in exactly the same way. So it's great, you're really nailing the recipe. He didn't like that so much. He wants to get rid of that queasy feeling. These companies are trying to be the Tesla of meat. They want to be better than the status quo. And they also want to be cool. You can see the day I happened to visit Beyond, the celebrity investor Chris Paul was also visiting Beyond. You know, I also get asked whether these ultra-processed industrial food technologies are really better for the climate than beef. Well, here the answer is hell yes, they are way better. Most plant-based alternatives use at least 90% less land than the animal equivalents. It's just way more efficient to eat crops directly than to launder them through a cow that has to breathe and keep itself warm and grow a brain and moo and do all kinds of cow things that don't make meat. The questions I can answer are how big plant-based protein will get and how long it will take. And those are the big questions. I assume that as it becomes cost competitive, just like solar electric cars, it's going to replace a lot of traditional ground beef and chicken nuggets. Plant-based steaks and other cuts with more complex textures and flavors might be tougher. I saw a company that was trying to 3D print steaks in Israel, but it's definitely not yet ready for prime time. But what could help there is the other big alternative protein craze getting buzz, and that's meat grown from animal cells without animal slaughter. Investment in these cultivated meat companies increased 500% in 2020. Just that company that's making eggs from mung beans, they're not now trying to make cell-based chicken nuggets. I tried a prototype. You can see this is it here in the middle. It tasted like chicken because it was chicken, just grown in a bioreactor rather than a live animal. So there was no need to waste resources on the feathers or the beak or the clucking. There are companies culturing everything from tuna sushi to Kobe beef. I met an Australian dude who's growing kangaroo meat and hopes to grow tiger meat, Galapagos tortoise meat, and even woolly mammoth meat. Who knows what'll taste good? All it takes is a little DNA to start. It's very exciting. And investors like Bill Gates think it's the future of food. There's just one hitch. That nugget I ate cost $90 to make in 2019 for one nugget. The costs are coming down fast, but cultivated meat is still at least 5 years away from growing mainstream. It is just not easy to grow meat outside an animal. Still, there's just incredible innovation in fake meat right now. Gates and Jeff Bezos invested in a science fiction-y company called Nature's Find. It built a factory in the Chicago neighborhood that used to have the stockyards, but instead of making meat by slaughtering animals, it's making meat from microbes harvested from the volcanic springs underneath Yellowstone National Park. A simpler startup that I love is the Better Meat Company, founded by a Humane Society executive named Paul Shapiro, who said, you know, beyond an impossible, there are these scientific juggernauts trying to replace meat someday with incredible technology, but I want to save chickens now. What if we just blended some plant protein into actual chicken nuggets, like a Prius instead of a Tesla? He cut a deal with his enemies at Purdue to do chicken plus nuggets. It's huge. Parents love it. It's saving chickens and saving the land used to raise chickens. You know, it's interesting. Shapiro is an ethical vegan. The CEOs of Impossible and Beyond and Just are also ethical vegans, but they are all extremely pragmatic problem solvers. They're trying to make the world better, not perfect, because better is better than worse. Well, that wasn't one of the original Earth Day messages, but it is definitely one of mine. My favorite example is the guy on the right. His name is Bruce Friedrich. He's the head of the Good Food Institute, the trade group for the alternative protein companies. He's this corporate technology maven in San Francisco. You can see he's got the architect glasses, he runs around cutting deals and lobbying politicians. Well, the guy on the left, that's also Bruce. Back when he was the head of advocacy for PETA, this scruffy vegan militant militant, throwing blood on people and getting arrested. He's still a vegan. He just decided that raging about the imperfections of the world is not the way to change the world. In fact, Bruce thinks the only good thing the animal rights movement ever achieved was to inspire a bunch of vegans to start all those fake meat biotech companies. All right, this leads me to policy. And I really do think it's important to be pragmatic. Yes, carbon taxes would be elegant, but they're slow, they're unpopular, and they're not the cure-all some economists think. The less elegant but more realistic way to encourage a lot of these solutions is to throw government money at them, which has been very effective at encouraging alternatives to fossil fuels. The most desperate need is money for research into agricultural and technological solutions. Remember, the land problem isn't like the fossil fuel problem. We still need to figure it out. The US government does a ton of research on how to boost farm yields, but approximately zero research on alternative proteins or food waste or some of these other problems. We really do need a Manhattan Project approach to the land problem. Federal research helped drive down the price of solar and electric vehicle batteries by 90%, and it can do the same for fake meat and fake peels and other food tech land sparing technologies. And then, yeah, we should pay farmers to reduce emissions too, but we should make sure we pay them to do the things that actually reduce emissions and stop paying them to grow biofuels. We should also spend a ton of money helping poorer countries make more food and destroy fewer carbon sinks. The best way to do that is known as produce and protect. The cash helps farmers increase yields on their fields, but it links that to enforcing protection for natural lands outside their fields. Oh, one more thing. We should kill all the farm lobby labeling bills that aim to ban plant-based or cell-based products from using words like meat or milk. I mean, come on. Hot dogs aren't made from dogs. Girl Scout cookies don't contain Girl Scouts, and consumers don't seem confused about that. These laws are just about protecting incumbents from competition. All right, I've talked about stuff technology can do and stuff government can do. Let me wrap up by talking about stuff you and I can do. This was the big message of the original Earth Day. It's the message in that pogo poster. We have met the enemy and he is us. Well, this is not the message of the modern climate movement. The new environmental correctness is that only large-scale political and institutional change can save the climate. So guilt-tripping people about what they eat and drive and whether they recycle or use plastic straws is just a distraction from government policies and corporate abuses. Focusing on individual action is victim blaming and virtual signaling that just alienates potential allies and carries water for big pollution who want us to blame ourselves for their problem. You can see I collect some of these headlines. I work in the environmental movement. I don't care if you recycle. You can't save the climate by going vegan. Why your carbon footprint is meaningless. Well, the technical term for this is bullshit. Sure, we need systemic change that makes it cheaper and easier for us to change our behaviors, but we also need to change our behaviors. Emissions are us, the fuel we burn, the electricity we consume, the factories and also the farms that make the stuff we buy and eat. ExxonMobil isn't forcing us to drive gas-guzzling SUVs to the mall, and Trump didn't force us to eat the equivalent of 3 burgers a week. It's true, reducing your individual emissions can feel like insignificant drops in a planetary bucket, but better is better than worse, and helping humanity is better than harming humanity. COVID was a vivid reminder that individual actions add up. People stopped driving, and suddenly Los Angeles had no smog. Shrinking our individual drops can buy time before the planetary bucket overflows. And how can you tell people to vote and lobby and fight for climate action because emissions are a crisis, and then tell them their own emissions don't matter? Especially when it comes to food and land, the climate simply can't be fixed without individual action. Project Drawdown's number 3 and number 4 solutions for reducing emissions were reducing food waste and shifting towards plant-based diets. So yeah, sorry if I'm guilt tripping you, but don't waste so much food. It's like throwing a chunk of rainforest down the disposal. And try to eat less meat, or at least less red meat. US beef consumption actually declined by a third since 1970. And even though chicken consumption increased more than that, the overall carbon effect was like taking 40 million cars off the road. If every American switched just one beef burger to a plant-based burger every week, we'd save a land area the size of Massachusetts every year. Right now, the average American eats 25 times more beef than salmon. So try the Blue House. It's better for you and the climate. There are lots of other things you can do to help. Use recycled paper and toilet paper, compost, don't use real leather or other cattle pie products, but the big ones are waste less food and eat less beef and lamb. And you know, this has been a battle at my house, but your pets can eat less beef and lamb too. Look, emitting carbon is not the worst sin. All of us carbon-based life forms do it, but we should try to do less of it. If COVID taught us anything, it's that we're capable of changing our behaviors in a crisis. And climate change really is a crisis. Solving the land problem will require some unfathomably radical behavior changes and policy changes and technology changes. But radical change always seems unfathomable until it happens. Otherwise, it wouldn't be radical. And you know what else would be unfathomable? The meteorological chaos that comes with 2 degrees of warming. We ought to be willing to do a few unfathomable things to try to avoid that. I know Elon Musk wants us to get a second home on Mars in case we make too big of a mess on our starter home. But if we've learned nothing else from 51 years of Earth days, we should know by now that it makes more sense to clean up the planet that already has oxygen and pizza and Boston Terriers and tennis and that Scoop There It Is Geico ad and all kinds of things we love. It is an awesome Earth. It's the only one we've got. We ought to try to stop eating it. And with that, I hope I have a little time for some questions.
Wow, that was an amazing presentation. Everybody knew that you were like a great writer, but definitely a great speaker. So we had a bunch of questions, but they've been answered because you covered pretty much everything. There's one question that we got
Stop
from
the share here, right? Yeah.
Tom Glazer. Yeah, you can stop sharing. Tom Glazer, maybe. Beyond corn for ethanol, how is U.S. taxpayer money being used unwisely? And how should we pressure our elected officials, I guess, to make the right investment and to stop subsidizing? That's the implication of that question. So,
oh boy, well, certainly biofuels and bioenergy are a huge one. You know, we have a renewable fuel standard that guarantees 35 billion gallons of you know, so-called renewable fuels, and you know, just about all of that goes you know, straight into deforestation. So you know, that's a bipartisan problem. It looks like Biden is going to be just as bad as Trump on that. But you know, we also have we let people graze cattle on public lands for just about nothing. You know, our elected officials have gotten really great at coming up with all kinds of loan deficiency payments and direct payments and conservation payments and all kinds of payments to shovel money to farmers. And I guess what I'm saying is that's fine. Let's try to shovel them money to do the kinds of things I'm talking about, to produce more food on less land, to leave their buffers alone. And especially to pour more money into research and deployment of these new technologies that we're going to need to save us. The Biden infrastructure bill actually may include a little bit of that.
Yeah, no, you gave us a lot to think about. I cannot wait for your book to come out. It's yeah, when we first one to buy. You mentioned Project Drawdown.
It's going to be a while, unfortunately.
And I'm sorry, Mike, because we're past the hour already. It's 7:05, and probably some people have to go. We have another webinar in 20 minutes.
If anybody wants to email me questions or hit me on Twitter,
use the chat and send your email. I'm gonna actually also simply make sure that everybody knows that this session will be recorded, and tomorrow you'll see it on the Earth Week page. So let me just also make sure I put my the Green New greenu@miami.edu email. That way you can send me your question for Mike, and I'll forward him the questions, and you can keep on this conversation. A lot of great ideas, a lot of controversial ideas also, probably. Super interesting. Thank you so much, Mike. Really glad to have the opportunity to meet you today and listen to you. This webinar, again, will be on the miami.edu/Earthweek website. Don't forget about the next events that we have today and tomorrow. We have the Clio Institute tomorrow, Climate 101. We have also our youth activist giving a panel session in the afternoon. And at 6, we also have Dr. Hood and Dr. Sandy Coy talking about the resurgence of the Atala butterfly, which is an imperiled butterfly on our campus. So with that, thank you, Mike. Hope to see you soon. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.